Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Very often you'll hear people, including me, talk about the system. And very often we'll talk about it as if it's some kind of machine or group of people with nefarious intent that are pulling the strings from behind the scenes to make things happen. And it's not that simple, is it? In fact, it's a lot more complicated and it's a lot more interesting and it's a little bit scarier. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about using some critical thinking, looking at the evidence and figuring out what's actually really happening. And the practical application of this is once you see what's happening, then you are free to escape and live your own life and not be beholden to the system. So what the heck are we talking about? Let's dive right in. You may have heard the term superorganism, and this is a term that people use sometimes to describe all of the people on the planet Earth. And no, I'm not talking about in a spiritual sense, but just we're all acting on what we believe is our own interests. We're all in different, clusters and groups of people and nations and everything that are interacting with each other. And there are emergent properties that happen when a group of people start interacting with each other in this way, especially when it's a very large group. And this can be affected by things as simple as where the resources are, where are the rivers, where are the heavy metals, all that kind of stuff, and where certain technological developments happened first. And I'm talking about simple ones like the plow, which made huge, huge differences in terms of who got the power and who didn't as this kind of cascaded and snowballed. But the thing is, not all these emergent properties are nice because evolution really doesn't care one way or the other. It just made, people became what they were because that helped them to survive. Now you put all of us together, really interesting things start to happen. Next thing you know, you have governments and roads and hospitals and, political parties and all that kind of stuff. They're emergent properties of that. But there's a more subtle and more nefarious, or maybe that's the wrong word, but it's troubling property of it. Insidious, I think we might call it. And that is the pressure we have on us from the system isn't just external, it's internal. And a lot of people say that this internal voice we have, that voice in your head, that critic, you know the one I'm talking about. I know it. What's always telling you you're doing something wrong. You're lazy. You should have done this differently. Those people don't like you, or you should have listened to what your friend said here. Or all these things, or maybe you shouldn't do that because it's immoral, or this isn't right. Where did all that come from? In a lot of cases, these messages aren't from us. People will call this sometimes they won't say it's one of your parts as a critic, like psychology will tell you sometimes. They'll say this is a mental parasite. Well, where does parasite come from? Well, it comes from all the messages we got from society, from our parents, from our peers, from institutions, from schools. All this stuff, all these things, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. These are the normal ways the society works. This is how you should behave. This is what you should and shouldn't do. And very often, as children, we're living our life and we're trying to be ourselves, and it pushes us into this little box instead. And you have that voice that stays with you that sounds like it's part of you, but where do those messages come from? And so in a certain way, the system infects you and defends itself from you by using your own voice. And it's not something where there's somebody pulling the strings in either of those examples. It's just what starts to happen. But isn't somebody pulling the strings? Come on, there's got to be something going on. Look at the evidence, right? Look at these people. Well, yes and no. A lot of these properties are emergent. However, it's a little bit too simple to say that, well, there's nobody benefiting and there's no head at the top of this. There are people, some people just believe because they were born into certain area, privilege or whatever. Some people simply believe that that's their right and that this is the way things ought to be. And so they take advantage of people. But there are other people that see what's actually happening. Maybe they don't see the entire system as such, but they see how people behave. They see how people can be manipulated. They see how people can be made to believe certain things, and they use that to their advantage in government, in business, wherever it happens to be, and they're able to really end up on top while a lot of other people kind of drown in society and in the system. They're able to ride it and use it. So there are people, and even in the past, there are some people who have kind of shaped how things went to a certain extent because they saw that, and there's a legacy from that. But, some people have said that, well, before any kind of hierarchy was invented, then human beings behaved differently. And, well, no, I don't believe that's the case at all. Because what is a system really? Well, there's at least 4 different components to it, or layers that cause this system to show up. And the first one is simply biological. Human beings are primates. Primates are hierarchical by nature. So these hierarchies, we showed up with them. You look at our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, they have very strong hierarchies. They're not very nice to each other. Pecking order is extremely important to them. These were things that served us, millennia ago as we were evolving. And we kind of bring them with us. And that shapes, to a certain extent, what the system becomes, because people are driven to want to be on the top and make the rules and make other people do certain things. And there's a certain amount of shame and conformity enforced by that. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying that's what tends to happen from the biological side. Then you get this cultural layer that starts to happen. And society teaches people, well, what's normal, what's right, what's good. And the cultures can vary, but very often they have the same, a lot of the same cores, but you can go to different countries or even different areas of the same country, and you can get culture shock because, of course, if you've experienced this, some of the beliefs can be very, very different. You're like, well, what are these people talking about? But they got imprinted with that as part of their programming, if you will, when they grew up. Then there's an institutional layer, because we start to form these institutions, like governments, like corporations, like the laws that we live by. And these start to give shape and structure to this system. And there's this architecture, if you will, that really starts to solidify what the system is. And then there's an ideological layer that floats on top of that. And this one is probably the most insidious of all, because we have beliefs about money, about success, about morality and identity, and things that are handed down to us as a result of all these institutions and cultures. And they get programmed into us and become part of our psyche. And we didn't necessarily think about them. That we were just told this is what's right. And we're justifying everything that we're doing. But these are stories that we start to tell each other. But we've got that inner critic that's telling us, well, this is, because of all these messages we got, they're telling us this is how we should behave. Nobody has to enforce the system. We enforce it ourselves. And that is where it becomes really, really insidious. And you might think to yourself, well, once people see this, they'll automatically break free. You should break free from this at this point. But it's a self-correcting. The system, we can speak about it, in an anthropological manner and talk about it as if it has wants and needs and desires. It doesn't. Maybe some of the people at the top do. But the system is just this emergent property of people. But it's very self-correcting. When somebody steps outside the norm, they get pushed back. They face disapproval, don't they? They face judgment. They get punished or mocked or shunned or ignored. And even well-meaning, we'll call them progressive groups of people, they fall into the same trap because they tell their people what to think. They demand conformity just to different norms, don't they? It's the same thing. You can change the flags, you can change the slogans, you can change the terminology, but if disagreement with a group leads to exile, the system is still doing its thing, isn't it? And that's why so many truth tellers and artists and free thinkers, they live on the fringe because of all this pressure. Not because they're wrong, but because they refuse to play the part. And so many people are buying into this system that we created, that now we treat as if it's a god. So what do? Revolution is not the solution. And you don't need a manifesto. You don't even need to go and try to free all the souls you can. You might have to do it one at a time, really. You're not going to be able to get on the street corner and start shouting this kind of stuff like I am in this YouTube video. That's not going to work. It just means that you recognize that the system is real. It's outside of you, but it's also in you. And that's the part that you can start to change. This is where you start to challenge your own thinking, to start to see, is this really my belief system? Are these really my thoughts, or are these things were imprinted on me? And, am I being compliant because I really want to be? Or am I being compliant because I just have that feeling that I should be, but it's not really coming from me? We start to reject that emotional and intellectual parasite, start to root it out, and start to remember who we really are. I'm not saying this is easy, but I am saying it's necessary to start to behave in a way that is most aligned with you, and to be authentic. And it doesn't mean you need to be antisocial and live on the fringe of society and do all that. It just means that you have the ability to behave as your authentic self, to not be controlled by what other people think. So maybe you could start that band, start that business, play that role-playing game, even though people think it's silly. Whatever it is, be able to be you and not be beholden to a system that isn't even real. You know what I mean? So it's time to wake up, reclaim the script, be yourself, think your own thoughts. You know, you might lose some friends, not about getting applause, but it's about being who you really are. And maybe that's enough to start a different kind of revolution. You know what I mean? Take it easy.